It's Thanksgiving, and I'm giving my thanks to the authors who've inspired me. Aloha and welcome back to my channel. I'm Marilyn Maya, the baby boomer booktuber. And in America, Thursday is Thanksgiving. So I want to wish all those who celebrate a happy Thanksgiving. We've been through a lot this year. It's been a terrible year, but I feel that there's some good that's coming along the horizon. Well, I hope so. Today I want to talk about something I'm grateful for, and that's books, but more specifically authors who have meant something to my life, who have inspired me, who have helped me get through this thing we call life, this tough thing sometimes. I was brought up quite poor, and I had a rough childhood, and my first experience with books were fairy tales, Grimm's in particular. And they kind of scared me because they're pretty grim. But then I found Hans Christian Andersen, and he was the first author that made me realize that fairy tales are so much more than what I could imagine. I picked up this particular book in Denmark, in the house of Hans Christian Andersen in the 80s. But I actually read a lot of his stories when I was quite young, and they meant so much to me that when I had the chance to go to Denmark, in Copenhagen, and I don't know if it was in Copenhagen that was his house, I don't think so, but I had a picture in front of his little house, and I went to the gift shop and I bought this. So this book means a lot to me and to my children. So of all his stories, the one that meant most to me was The Ugly Duckling. And the reason is I felt like an ugly duckling when I was young, and that feeling stayed with me. I had a mother who, it's not her fault, but she was bipolar and she called me bad names. So I retained that poison that was in my life. But then I read The Ugly Duckling, and I want to share with you one of Hans Christian Andersen's quotes from The Ugly Duckling. He said, "It is only with the heart that one can see clearly, for the most essential things are invisible to the eyes." To the eye. And that was a quote from The Ugly Duckling. And as I got older and I realized how important that quote was, I began to feel better. And so another story that I recommend in this book, and I'm going to do this with all my authors, is The Snow Queen. Now, it's not Frozen, The Snow Queen. It's a very, very interesting story, and it also has, as many of Hans Christian Andersen's books have, a moral of the story, and a beautiful moral. My next book I don't have with me, but meant so much to me, was another author was Betty Smith, and she wrote A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I read this not in school. It wasn't a required book to read in school, but I read it quite a few times. And it's the story of Francine Nolan, who grows up in Brooklyn, and there's a tree outside her window, and she is navigating life in poverty and with an alcoholic father, and finds books. I was amazed to find out on my second reading, that the exact place that she talks about, because her books are autobiographical, and she admitted it later in life, but she talks about streets where I was raised. Now, she was raised in what they called cold water flats in Brooklyn, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn. And the time that I was born, they had torn down all those flats, but they kept some of the names. So when she talks about Stagg Street or Manhattan Avenue, Leonard Street, those were the streets around the project that I was brought up in. And that meant so much to me, that she walked those same streets, of course in a different time. And that book meant so much to me that I had to read all of her other books. I had to find out more about her. And Paul Theroux is an author of mostly travel related books, and he said that, I don't remember what book he said this in or if it was an article, but he said that the way he gets to know an author is to read every book they wrote. And that's what I did. I looked for all the books that Betty Smith wrote, and the one that I love them all, but the one that touched me the most is her last book, which, beside, of course, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, is called Joy in the Morning. And it's also a memoir, an autobiographical memoir, about how she met her husband and they moved to the Midwest, and she started becoming interested in finishing school, and how hard it was to navigate life as a married woman. And it's a really beautiful book. I'm going to read a quote from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And that quote is, of course, about books. And Francie is speaking. From that time on, the world was hers for the reading. She would never be lonely again, never miss the lack of intimate friends. Books became her friends, and there was one for every mood. There was poetry for quiet companionship. There was adventure when she tired of quiet hours. There would be love stories when she came into adolescence, and when she wanted to feel a closeness to someone she could read a biography. On that day when she first knew she could read, she made a vow to read one book a day as long as she lived. What a wonderful quote that was from the book. I was an only child growing up, and I was very lonely. And this brought me hope that in books I could never be lonely. And to be honest, that came about. I could never say that I was lonely. I can say that I was heartbroken. I can say that I was in pain. I could say that I was in grief. But I really was never lonely because I always had a book. Well, the next author is one that's very popular among BookTube, Jane Austen. And I have to say that I wasn't introduced to Jane Austen until I was in my 30s. And I was going through a very tough time. And I read in a magazine that one should read all of Jane Austen's books at least once a year to feel good about the world. And so I went about and did that. And of course it was heaven. One of my favorite books from Jane Austen is Mansfield Park. And it deals with Fanny Price, who was sent to live with her aunt, Lady Bertram, and her uncle, St. Thomas, in their country estate, Mansfield Park. And I've heard that it has a lot to do with education. And I haven't read it lately, and I intend to do that. It's not one of Jane Austen's most popular novels, but I remember it as being one of my favorite. And here is a quote from the book. A fondness for reading, properly directed, must be an education in itself. That is very true. I didn't get to graduate high school because I got married at 16 to escape my situation. and that was the only way you could escape in my culture and in that time. And when I went back to school for my senior year, there was rumors that I had gotten married during my junior year, which was true, and I couldn't lie, and they told me I couldn't go back to school. And it was many years later, well, I would say 5 years later, that I got my GED and I started taking classes, college level classes. But it was a blow to me that I couldn't finish school. I loved school. I loved certain aspects about school, shall we say. But I had reading, and I found out during my life, my 7 decades of living, that if you read, you're educated. Keep on reading, you learn more. You can learn more than what school can even offer you. And I did finish college in my late 30s, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life, not because of what school taught me, but it was something that I had longed for ever since I was thrown out at age 16. The next book, the next authors that meant a lot to me, I guess the most during my late 30s and 40s, and even before that, was Agatha Christie and Earl Stanley Gardner. I'll speak about Agatha Christie first because I've read during my life most of her books, and what she gave me, what her books gave me, was an escape into a mystery, into a puzzle that I can forget all my problems. And believe me, I had some problems. Let me give you one of her quotes that is not from her books, but is actually probably from her autobiography, but I'm not sure. There's 2 quotes. One says, "Very few of us are what we seem." And the second one is, "Fear is incomplete knowledge." I love both of those quotes. Agatha Christie was a pretty mysterious woman. In the 20s, when she was married to her first husband, and I think he was Mr. Christie, she disappeared for I don't know how many days, but she disappeared and was found in sort of a spa under her husband's mistress's name. And that's a mystery in itself, and they never really found out what was going on, but she went through some kind of breakdown. So I really respect her words, her quotes, because she's saying she wasn't what she seemed, and nobody is what they seem. And in her books, in her mysteries, people are often not what they seem. So I loved Agatha Christie. I want to reread all her books again, because sometimes I like an escape. And mysteries and thrillers are my favorite form of escapism. The second author I put in is Earl Stanley Gardner. And that might not be a familiar name, author, to some people, yet he meant a lot to me in my 20s. When I was married, I couldn't go to school, and I would go to used bookstores, and I was very attracted to the girls that were on the cover. They were always mysterious girls on the cover, and he wrote the Perry Mason books. And believe me, they were light reading, but yet every book has a gem of knowledge that you can pick up. And I was fascinated with the way he wrote and the way he wrapped up his cases, and I became very enamored with his TV show too around that time. And even earlier, my mother was enamored with when I was very small, because the original Perry Mason show was in the 50s. But I started collecting the books because I liked the pictures, I liked the photos. And I recently went on Amazon, and I saw that I looked up one of the books that I remembered by heart, and it was The Case of the Sulky Girl. And why I remember this book is because my children were small, and they would say, sulky girl, and they would look at the picture. and it was a picture of a girl. Now they made the cover was changed into a knife and a grisly scene, which I didn't appreciate. But anyway, you should check out Earl Stanley Gardner, because I think he was a good writer in the pulp fiction era, but he had a certain style that maybe was more of a Chandler type book, Raymond Chandler, and I also liked him too. But I said that I would only do 5 books, but I'm lying because there's so many authors that I love. The next type of books were the books that I looked to when I was very depressed, when I was anxious. They're kind of how-to books, psychological books. And there's so many. One I talked about was Letting Go, which is a book about when you're heartbroken, and I talked about this in another video. And of course, my series of Mental Health Mondays, where I'm discussing the 4 agreements, which really helped me to heal when I hit 50. So that's how long it took. But I have to give a special shout out to Dr. Susan Forward, who wrote so many books that help women. And one of her books was named The Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. And a quote from her book is, what makes a woman vulnerable to mistreatment at home, no matter how well she functions outside, is the belief that her need for her partner's love is the most important thing in her life. And growing up in the time that I grew up, and in the culture that I grew up, being a Latina woman, we were supposed to put our men up on a pedestal, no matter how sleazy, how horrible they treated us. And that was a terrible lesson for a young girl to have. So I was glad to read all these authors. And some other authors that I have to give a shout out, and I just found out she passed away this past May, is Barbara Sher, who wrote the book Wishcraft, not Witchcraft, Wishcraft, where I learned that anything was possible. And that goes back to how I, as a struggling housewife, could afford to go to Europe, because I read that things are possible if you only wish them and make them happen by different ways. You make things happen by counting on other people, by reading books, by writing things down. And there's another book it's way out of print, and it was during a period when I was very ill physically, and it was called The Spa Book by Judy Babcock, and I'll have a picture of it. It's really not applicable for our time right now, because many of those spas they spoke about are long gone. And when I was in the hospital with pneumonia and other ailments in my late 30s and 40s, I read this book from beginning to end, and I imagined myself being in that spa, being tended to, exercising, doing meditation. I actually put myself in that book, and that meant so much to me. And no other book really came close. There's many books about spas, and if you know of one, put it down below. I can't afford to go to one, and we're in quarantine, but for some reason, books about self-care are really helped me when I was in my low periods of life. Well, I have to give a special shout out to Maya Angelou, because through her books, and I did meet her in person, I was very fortunate to meet her in person, where she did a speaking tour in St. Paul, Minnesota, when I went to school there. That's where I went to college. And she was as kind in person as she is in her books. And I she had said something in her book, and I just sat in the chair and I was crying, and she came over to me and she called me honey. She put her hand on me, and she spoke to me for a few minutes. That meant a lot to me. And her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, was so touching that I gave myself the name Maya. So that's where Maya comes from. And she gave so many people so much joy in her life that she is one of the most special authors on this list. And yet I listed her last because I felt that she surpasses everyone on this list, because I actually met her in person and I was touched by her kindness. So, my friends, I hope you enjoyed my Thanksgiving books of authors that have meant so much to me. And I hope that you put down your favorite author, what they meant to you. Did they touch you? Which authors were they? Because there's many others that touched my life. These are 5 or more that were specifically there for me when I needed them. But put down in the comments what authors touched you. I really would appreciate that. And if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll know when I put up new videos. And until we meet again, my friends, have a happy Thanksgiving if you're in America, and to everyone else, aloha e oi.